Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is the importance of racial equity in environmental conservation. And it will be presented by our very own WWF Charles Costen-Sumpter. Charles, thank you so much for being here today and for sharing your story with us. I cannot wait to hear all about you and your perspective and dive into some pretty juicy questions. So let's get to it.
Thank you, Sunny, for having me, and thank you to the NatHab community for this opportunity. I had the opportunity to talk to staff a couple of months ago, and that was a great experience for me as well. I've been looking forward to expanding on that conversation as well with this amazing group. So I'm Charles Costen-Sumpter. I'm the Senior Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the World Wildlife Fund. Um, my reach spans across all of our offices within the United States, as well as offices that come under our sort of jurisdiction around the world. Um, a bit about myself. I was born and raised in the South Bronx in New York City, and the environment was not something that I really thought about. Um, Not something that my family thought about. Um, and conservation was an even further thought um, than actually just being out in the environment, living in it, enjoying it. It's not something I thought about. I'm going to tell you a story. My great grandmother, actually, she was my great great grandmother. She lived to be 105, and I had the opportunity to know her and talk to her. She passed away in 2005. Um, and so my parents, my mother, my aunts, my grandmother would often tell a story to us grandkids and to my mom and her brothers and sisters that my great great grandmother would talk about a man in a cage in New York City around 1905, '06, '07. And my great grandmother was a child. She was born in 1898. And she would just talk about this man in the cage. And my mother and uncles and aunts didn't know what she was talking about, what she was referencing. And she said they put that man in the cage. I don't know if many of you are familiar, you may be, with a man by the name of Oda Benga. And he was a young man from, at the time, the Free State of Congo in Africa. And he was brought to the United States. Um, Many different sort of people had handled him at some time. He was in circus and things like that. He ended up at the Bronx Zoo, um, or the New York Conservation Society, as it's called. And he was placed in a cage. He had a monkey that he would hold and a bow and arrow that he would use while he was in that cage. And people looked and gawked at him as if he was a zoo animal. And so when the time my family had, my great grandmother would say that, the internet wasn't around. No one had researched or looked it up. They just thought she was just something happened in the early 1900s and it was a faraway tale that they didn't really investigate. Well, I did. And I looked it up and she was talking about Otabenga. Now, she didn't see him, um, but she just remembered people talking about that. Um, and that was sort of my introduction to conservation in the environment and the sort of two worlds that exist when it comes to conserving the environment, what that means, who does that work and who doesn't, who's excluded from that work, and why. That severing of that relationship persists for generations. When you're seen as other, as Oda Benga was, there's not a place you want to interact in. You don't want to be a part of that type of situation. And he died a very sad life. He lived a very sad existence. He died here in Virginia. I'm in Virginia, about a couple of hours south of where I live, um, in a very tragic way. Tried to get back to Africa many times. By the time he was a teenager, we were in World War One had started. There were no ships going that way, so he was essentially stuck here. Um, and that's not even getting to the history, right, of slavery in this country, um, in terms of that connection to the land, to the environment, to animals. It's not something my great grandmother thought about. It's not something my grandparents thought about. It's not something my parents thought about. Their focus was around providing a space for us to live, food to eat, basic necessities, and they did a damn good job doing that. But I am like many other people, whether indigenous, whether African American, whether another person of color, who in this country has had a very strained relationship with the environment and what it means to conserve it. So fast forward, I get to DC, I start doing all types of other work. I started on Capitol Hill, and I later went to work for the local DC City Council. I had a policy background. That was really my interest. Um, and technical government things, contracting, law, stuff like that. Good government. But I was a staffer for the chairman of the Environment Committee, well, government operations and the environment. But all my work was on the government operations side. But I had the opportunity to work on some environmental legislation for the very first time in my life. And it was the plastic bag tax here in DC, that I helped to draft. And so that's where institutions would charge a consumer 5 cents per bag in the attempt to reduce plastics in the environment and in our rivers, which was the intent of that bill, was to clean up the Anacostia River, which was heavily polluted for years. All the wildlife, right, was gone, and it was a sore sight in the District of Columbia. So that was back in 2009, and I was like, wow, I've helped clean up the environment, right? How did I do that? What does this mean? That was sort of my first foray into interest, and that desire that I had around, I don't know how to help the situation, right? It's so much bigger than me. What can I do? I don't have a background in science, or didn't realize that I didn't need to at that time, that I had something else that can contribute to our collective solution. And I can start with a river in DC. Um, Come forward another decade or so, there's catfish that are now back in the Anacostia River. Now, folks are saying you might not be able to eat them just yet, but they have come back. And I was on a river tour maybe mid last year, and they said maybe within the next 2 to 3 years, the fish that are there, that they can declare that they are edible, because the amount of toxins that were there, not just the plastic bags, but the other things that bill put more attention on, spotlighted, have stopped, and that the water is much more cleaner than it used to be. And so I saw turtles. I saw all types of wildlife that were along the banks, living. exploring. So we get to around 2020, and I'm a consultant at Deloitte Consulting, um, and we're in the summer sort of upheaval. As many of you know, the Black Lives Matter movement, and I'm leading DEI efforts on behalf of the State Department. Um, and then that happens, the killing of George Floyd, and our attention really just goes straight to equity in our work at state, right, or at wherever. And I realized I really have a passion that I didn't know. I didn't know that I had that, and I didn't realize I was working in DEI prior to even being called that. Um, and I realized, I like doing this work, but I didn't like being a consultant anymore. I didn't like making changes that I didn't see sort of the long run, the changes that was happening. I would do one thing, go on to a next project, and I would never know if what I did was successful. I believe it was. I hope it was, but I didn't have any evidence of it. I didn't see it. And so I it's like something with this DEI thing. I gotta explore that further for myself. And so I left Deloitte. I didn't have a job. I didn't know what I was going to do. I just knew I wasn't happy doing that, and I had to find something to do that made me happy. And my husband was very clear, like, yeah, I think this is time for you to do that. You need to go and step outside and see what it is that's going to really make you happy. And it's not consulting. What is it? And he's like, I see this DEI thing is you really taking on with you, and I loved it. And I saw an advertisement for head of DEI at the World Wildlife Fund. And I'm like, is that environmental organization, the commercial with the elephants and the panda? And I'm like, yeah, that is that organization. What are they doing about DEI? Why is that of interest to the organization? But I'm like, let me explore this because I remember, the bag tax, climate change, right? That was the thing that everyone was talking about. Maybe I have something to offer there. Maybe I can help make a change in that. And so I applied. And this was an extensive set of questions before I even got to an interview or anyone. Like, you have to answer all these questions. And I just remember thinking these questions were so well thought out and crafted that these folks, whoever wrote this, whoever had this requirement, knew what they were talking about, knew what was needed, and I became incredibly impressed with that. And I took my time, I answered every single question, and got the interview, and met an amazing set of folks who, on the first sort of conversation, I knew were serious about this. I knew they were committed. I knew that maybe they didn't, as an organization, had all the things in place, but I got the feeling that there was a commitment. And my only sort of caveat that I remember telling who became my mentor boss, I didn't want to have to convince people, leadership, why this was important work to do. There's enough fights in the world and work, and I didn't want that to be sort of my first uh, agenda item, as it was in other places where I had done DEI work. Because that's exhausting. It takes a lot of time, and it takes away from the goal of where you're trying to get when you have to convince um, why someone's existence matters in this work. And so my eventual boss was the person who had my role. She was the first head of DEI at the World Wildlife Fund, Renee Johnson. And so she was promoted to our head of people and culture, which is our HR team. But she was still very much attached to this role and into this work. And so again, I knew from reading those questions that someone knew what they were talking about when they wrote them. And I immediately felt that I had a partner, right, who's at the leadership level or senior management level, who was committed, who was bought in, who would be a partner and making sure that we are successful. Um, so I joined. It's been 2 years that I've been at WWF and have had the great pleasure of building upon the foundation that Renee started, um, as well as those across the organization who are committed, um, who care about equity, who care about inclusion. Maybe you don't know all how to do it or all the nuances, but are willing to be okay with being educated and trying to learn and doing some work on their own. So that's how I come to this work. One of the key things that I lead at WWF is a focus on diverse representation in the environmental conservation field. Now, it's no secret that the environmental conservation field is predominantly white. It has been that way for many years, and there are many reasons for that. Uh, Populations of folk have been historically excluded from participation in our environment, from our indigenous peoples whose land theft for generations. We've seen the impact of that. We've seen how many tribes cherish the land, how they curated it, the wildlife, the stewardship was destroyed. And we've seen generations of Black people who have been subject to systemic and oppressive inequities for generations as well. How people were snatched away from their connection to land. And there's a concept called Sankofa, which is not being afraid to look back at that past, at that history, that I think is going to be the bridge to a new sort of focus, a new view, a new stewardship of how we treat the land and our relationship to the environment. So how do we get at that dynamic around representation and increasing representation in conservation? Why is that important? And so we created a program at WWF. It's called Bridge. Bridge. Bridge is our diversity focused internship program for undergraduates and graduate students from historically excluded populations. Um, and we bring those students here for 10 weeks during the summer. We just finished our sort of offer letter stages. So we got all of our 41 interns who are coming from all across the country. Um, and they might not have an interest in environmental conservation because conservation is not a field that pays a lot. It's for people who have a passion already. Maybe their parents some way worked in that field and they can afford to kind of live off a pretty meager salary in places that compared to other jobs in consulting where I was, especially here in DC. And so we want to expose a new generation of people who might not have thought about I could be in conservation or what that looks like, mainly because they haven't seen it before, probably. And so those students are here in DC, and they work on many different things, from climate resilience work, from work in our oceans and our fisheries, to our HR department, where I sit. Um, because understanding that everyone has a role in conservation. It's not just the scientists, it's not just the PhDs. You can be any role you have contributes to saving our only planet. And there is interest in the youth out here who want to feel like they are making a difference, that someone's thinking about what they bring to the table. And so, one of the things I say at WWF a lot is we've been trying it for 60 years this way. Maybe it's time to give it a different shot. Bringing others to the table can bring those vastly different perspectives that maybe we haven't considered for 61 years. The challenges our planet faces are immense. And so I think we all benefit from diverse perspectives, um, those different solutions that come to the table. And we need to make sure that there's room at the table for those diverse perspectives. And so the Bridge program does just that. We're in our fourth year this year here, and each year we change it up. We think about different ways to shake up the program. We give students an opportunity to interact with our senior leadership. We do a speed networking event with members of our board and our students so that they get the opportunity to demonstrate their interests, learn more, ask questions, and now for the first time can think, I could do that. I could be that one day. I wish, like I say, sometimes I wish that had appeared to me when I was in college or in high school. Um, but I have a way now to impact that and to sort of live that sort of desire in this role at WWF. Another sort of initiative we focus on is a partnership with the Smithsonian Museum, the Smithsonian Institution, where we work with high school students, right? Sometimes college may be a bit too late. Grad school might be late, maybe not, but for some it could be. So, how do we get at that even further? Well, through our partnership with the Smithsonian, we work within high school just across the river in DC into Prince George's County, Maryland. And we work with a high school that has students that are majority from international countries, many of them in South America, many whose first language isn't English, um, but who have a green club. And members of my team and myself work with those students every week on a project that they're working on, whether it's fixing a greenhouse, building birdhouses on campus, um, or working to compost school lunch to reduce food waste, or develop public relations campaigns around recycling in their school. This is an opportunity to now go even further back to a population of folks who are also historically excluded, which are members of our immigrant community. And so now we've brought them in to this conversation at an earlier age. So by the time they get to college, they may major in environmental science. They may major in animal sciences. And so we're priming the pump of that next generation of environmental conservationists. Again, a bridge. And then we come to another sort of initiative that we focus on, which is our diverse talent pipeline. So let's say you don't get into bridge this year. What do? Our team has created, it's sort of a customer relationship tool within our hiring system that you have been identified as a key talent for further engagement, further relationship building with WWF because we want you and we're going to find that right position May not be this program, may not be this year, but to keep that conversation going so that by next year, maybe this is the right time for you. Maybe there's a role that fits your qualifications and your experience. And so we're developing that sort of hand holding to sort of put energy, put interest into that next sort of generation. So we're reaching out to historically Black colleges and universities, Hispanic serving institutions, um, tribal colleges. One of my team members is actually out in Bozeman, Montana right now. I'm visiting tribal colleges talking about equity in the conservation field. Now, we're a small team, it's three of us. And so we have to be measured in our approach and strategic with our resources. But we feel we can get the best sort of return by focusing on those high priority communities. And so that's what I would encourage people to do if they're looking to increase diversity, increase equity, uh, increase exposure, is you got to do that work. You got to examine those biases that exist. And within conservation, there are many of them. Within our hiring practices, there are many of them. And so to get at some of that, we got a grant, WWF, back in 2022 from the Walmart Family Foundation to develop a racial equity plan. And we were one of maybe 10 organizations that participated in this pilot. And the pilot included, there was a focus on having, the most senior level people be part of the pilot at WWF and at the other organizations, American Red Cross and others, to show the really strong commitment, right, to this work. And so we had our chief operating officer, we had Renee Johnson, our head of people and culture, and other executives be a part of this sort of project team that took 6-7 months to think through what are some of our most racially charged problems. How do we identify that? Where are they? Um, and so we came up with about 5 points. How do we tie it all together? So there's a racial equity statement. What does it say? How does racial equity in our work align? And so we're in the process right now. Like we're getting that statement sort of reviewed and looked at by other groups. There's comments, there's other opinions that we're considering. But one way to tie it all together, right, was a statement. Then we looked at our talent best practices. What could we be doing to root out initial biases in the hiring process? And here's one of them, right, that we sort of had to think about. Do we recruit only from the same institutions? And if so, what challenges does that pose to us? We may be losing diversity of thought, of approaches. And we've been doing that for years. What training is needed? How do we think differently about our recruitment efforts? And we've taken that situation very seriously and by the horns, trying to think differently, to think of a more of a behavioral approach to talent acquisition, and not so much a who do you know, or well they're close to me, so I need this done right now. I need someone who's really close to DC. Well, do you? Or I need them right now. An experience bias. I need them yesterday. Well, by need them yesterday means you are now fully engulfed in your bias. You're only going to see certain things. Who are you missing in that? Our racial equity plan also has a focus on those equity sort of competencies that every manager should have. So sometimes we grade, and this isn't a WWF thing, this is across any field. We usually grade our managers on how good they are at doing their job, whatever that is. But usually not whether or not they know what they're doing when it comes to people. That often gets overlooked. And so we have to get our managers, train our managers, equip our managers with the type of competencies that they need to engage in today's environment, today's world, through a racial equity mindset. That people come to their job, to the office with the whole persona, a whole history that they might be dealing with that you may not understand. And although you may not have experienced it, I want to give you the skill set, the competencies to be able to have those conversations with your staff in that way, to be able to be mindful, to understand those challenges. And so we're working on different types of training activities to equip our managers. I actually run a racial equity training series for all of our teams. And they sign up, and I do 3 to 4 hour sessions with them where we talk about the origins of racism in this country. We talk about systemic racism and what that means. We talk about privilege, and we do a privilege walk. And these are folks who are scientists, right? Who have been in the field 30, 40 years, who have never engaged in an activity like that. I just did one 2 weeks ago. It was sort of the feedback I got. Like, I've never thought about my privilege and how that shows up at work. And so those types of experiences, those types of, you know, things that you go through are how we become more well-rounded, how we become more supported. Um, Doing the work is important, accomplishing the mission is important, but how we do it is also important, right? Our mission is to create a more harmonious environment between the natural world and humans. And how better to do that than to look through it through the lens of racial equity? Racial equity is when you cannot predict someone's sort of fate, their plot in life, their careers, their life, their families, when you can't predict the outcome based solely on their race. And in the United States of America, and I harp on that because we do a lot of international work, but when I focus on the US, we haven't achieved that yet. We're working on it, but we haven't achieved that yet. And what a place to do that than in the field of environmental conservation. Because how important is biodiversity? We measure progress on our goals. We measure the effects, the detriment to the planet through declining biodiversity. So this is intertwined with our work to save the planet, to reduce the effects of climate change. And who do those impacts disproportionately affect? People from marginalized communities. And so it makes perfect sense that those people who are going to have to deal with these effects more be present, be in the room when those conversations are had around how do we solve it? How do we mitigate it? And so that's the importance of racial equity in this field. We only have one planet, right? There's no planet B. This is the one we have. And so I'm all for expanding and talking about our work, but also helping other organizations begin their own journey toward more equity um, in whatever field they are. But my particular interest is around environmental conservation. You see, the White House has developed their climate corps of next gen climate activists, and we see a whole crop of youth who are coming up who want to desperately get involved in this work. And I'm hopeful about the future. I know there's a lot of doom and gloom around climate change and what's happening with the environment, but I am so incredibly hopeful because we're starting to think differently about our approaches and who's in the room, who's having those conversations, who's asking those questions. And so we got to think about ways to harness that. And it's never too late to start thinking about that. One thing, additionally, that I'll bring up is we've created at WWF our employee resource group. And when we first started, we had 4, we had 8, and now we're at 12. And these are affinity organizations at WWF. We have one for our Black environmentalists. We have one for our Hispanic and Latino environmentalists. We have one for our Asian American, Pacific Islander, LGBTQ plus, and one for younger conservationists who are just getting in the field, and one for our more seasoned conservationists who have been in it for 20 plus years. And to hear the conversations that those two groups have is tremendously sort of enriching, and it helps with the hope that I have for the future. Um, and so, one of the biggest sort of asks from our younger conservation group is called Eco Network, is to make sure that there's a seat at the table for our next generation of youth, um, that they have a voice. I actually got an anonymous comment the other week about that very thing. We're doing it, but we want more of it. We want to see more of that. And so those are the things we're trying to do to create that inclusive environment where we value experiences, thoughts, perspectives, backgrounds that will contribute to what I think will be a more inclusive environment for all of us. And racial equity, I think, is at the core of that. Because once that has been achieved, I think all others will begin to follow. We will truly have some dynamic solutions to some of our most pressing challenges that faces our environment. So, thank you.
Charles, thank you so much for sharing your personal story and your perspective and your passion with us. Very, very juicy stuff. Let's dive a little deeper here.
Sure.
Can we start with just defining what DEI means?
Yeah. So diversity, equity, and inclusion. Think about it this way. Diversity is having many people in the room, just present. You may not be talking to them, may not be doing anything with them, they might not be speaking, might not be interacting. They're just there, right? So that sort of sets the stage. And that's an important part of this. Who's in the room, as I just talked about? Inclusion is, well, now let's all sit down to dinner in that room and everyone has a plate of food. So we're all sitting down, engaging together. We're all in the room. We're all about to engage in the same activity. Now, equity. What if although I'm in the room, although I have access to a plate, maybe the chair, I'm not able to sit in this particular type of chair. Has that been thought of? How have I been accommodated to be able to participate fully for me? So equity is not equality. Equality is we all get here, we all get the same thing. Equity is a specific attention to that person's need. So I'm in the room, I'm at the table with you all, but this particular chair, I cannot sit in, maybe for ability reasons. But was space made for me to serve and join as I can? That's equity.
That's a great way of describing it. Thank you. Brene Brown, I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but she likes to include belonging. And it seems to me in this particular context, thinking about land, belonging would be an important dimension to add. Do you have any thoughts on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging?
Absolutely. Belonging is that piece where sometimes it can get hard to, like, how do you quantify that? How do I measure that? So how I think about it is we have we have so we groups have diversity councils. We have an inclusion council where we have all of our leads from our employee resource groups and our CEO and COO. And one of the things that I bring up at that meeting is what policies and practices do we subscribe to that are harmful to people? Because we do a pulse survey and I don't know how to tell, oh, I want to belong. But if we identify those policies that are harmful, one of them being having interns that work for free, having non-paid internships, and that comes up a lot. Now our internship is paid, but it's not the only. There are some that don't. There's some that do, but large scale, the policy itself does not exist. And there are staff who say, I don't want to be at a place that has people working for free. I agree. We shouldn't. So let's work at that.
Mhm.
So it's identifying those different practices. One of them also being parental leave
Mhm.
was huge a couple of years ago because we were, I think, at 4 weeks, and that people left because of that. Um, that was increased after listening to staff about what works for them.
Mhm.
And I think we're thinking more about that when it comes to our sort of hybrid policy. Coming to work a couple of days a week, what that looks like. I think we're looking at that as well. Those measures to me are indicators of the belonging.
Mhm.
Because you can be included, you can be there, but is this a place for me? I think you have to weigh that. And I think there are things we can do to help on the belonging index. And it's looking at the policies that people say are harmful to them.
Thank you. Um, I imagine that the people listening to this conversation fully accept that ecosystems are healthier and more resilient when they're diverse. So where where in the human psyche is this blind spot that can't turn the camera around and look at the human population in the same way and recognize the value in a diverse population? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a good question. Because biases are hard. They're hardwired in our brains. We all have them, right? I'm not absolved from that. We all have biases. Um, it's almost like you have to know when the environmental factors that help those biases like become expedited. You got to know when that's happening. Here's an example. Um, someone was asking me to approve some decision for a staff member, and it's like, well, I need that. We got to get this done in terms of, I believe, it's their hybrid location. Um, but there were reasons for why that was requested for that staff member. It's because they're a caretaker, and so I could immediately got in my zone because this needed to happen yesterday. This approval needed to happen, or denial, actually, it was a denial, needed to happen. Well, let's think about this because I can easily just go with that first sort of recommendation to me because time is of the essence. Well, let's think about the other perspective because I too have had to caretake before. And so just challenging yourself, not sort of getting rushed to make quick decisions without asking those different types of questions and giving yourself and your brain time to process it, to think about it.
Hmm.
And when we don't do that, sometimes we allow those biases to seep in, and you may not even be thinking it's happening. It's unconscious sometimes. It just occurs, and it just sort of runs, and you're like, oh well, I didn't even think about it. Well, that's how this happens. Um, does every person who does our work have to be from the Yale School of Forestry, which is sort of the bias we have at WWF, pedigree bias? That you only think, well, that's because that's all we've had. That's good. Well, it's also good to think about, well, maybe we've had years of Yale School of Forestry. Let's try someone else. Let's think of another school that may offer this is good of a person that we can hire than we have before. But it's because we've always done it that way. Challenge yourself to stop and think, is this the best decision? Am I letting my biases and sort of my internal drive just run me? Or am I stopping and asking myself those types of questions? And it's something that you just have to train yourself to do. It doesn't change overnight. It's not easy to not listen to that all the time, and to actually challenge yourself to slow down and reevaluate and stuff.
Hmm. Excellent. Thank you. Um, how do you measure your return on investment of the DEI programs? Um, this person is thinking about how to encourage funding to support these efforts. Like, how do you know if they're working?
That is the question that we get asked, and I still have to find the data and metrics to explain it, but I also have a narrative. But on the first part of it, here's an example. So for Bridge, the internship program, what we did this year, what we haven't done in past years, is we have asked a survey of the students beforehand around what has been your interest or knowledge of environmental conservation. And a lot of times it's no. So far it's been not a lot, never, no, none. At the end, which we'll do in August, is we will survey the students again to say, ask the same questions. Like, since this experience, will you now consider a career in conservation, environmental conservation? I'm hoping, right, that the answer is yes, that we will, that I want to do this. I love this. This is great. I want to change my major, right, whatever that may be. I want to capture that, begin to look at the data. And now we will have some analytics to say, well, because of this program, X percent of interns have now decided they will now pursue a career in conservation. And so I can tell my senior leadership, I can tell my board to keep investing in this program because this is what we want. That's the desired end goal, and this is how we're getting there. And so that is the feely good stuff. I think we've had to you just have to do it the last first couple of years. We're now thinking, all right, what are some of the metrics? What can we now target What can we say? Um, is there a greater return or investment from having a more diverse workforce now? I would argue yes, because they bring different perspectives, they bring a different knowledge base. But I also have to also think about the financials. How much are we bringing in, right? Now, there are certain grants we can now go after because of our focus in diversity, equity, inclusion. There are specific donors who want to give to organizations that are focused on this work. And so the Walmart grant, right? That's an example of there's value in what this is, right? We're a nonprofit organization. And so we go after all types of grants. But we weren't going after those. We weren't getting that. And so with the focus on it, those are now grant funds that are specifically targeted to diversity, equity, inclusion efforts that we're going after. And so I'm almost, it's like self-sustaining my work by going after things that we previously were not going after. Our donor base, right? And so this is another sort of new way to get at this. We haven't talked to a lot of donors of color, and that is a cost. And so working with our development and our fundraising team, who now has a DEI committee, um, they're strategizing around how do we attract a whole new generation of donors, because quite honestly, our normal donor base, right, is it's aging out, um, and that's just a reality of business, of life. And so, to be more agile, we need to be thinking about different groups of people to go after, um, to raise money, to receive those funds that will go to our conservation mission. So that's another avenue that hasn't materialized fully yet. I think we've just sort of realized we need to be doing that. But that will be a way that I will measure sort of our impact is through our diversity of our donor based diversity and where we're getting some of those dollars and donations from.
Wow, thank you so much. That is the last question we have today. But I just want to thank you for sharing again such a personal story and for really showing us that the wisdom at the core of conservation is really the same wisdom at the core of DEI efforts. And I'm really glad that we got to know you and what work you and WWF are doing. I'm so glad that NatHab is also really expanding our programs and making great efforts to hire folks with diverse perspectives and backgrounds. And um, it's exciting to see this movement taking off and really making some changes in the field. I'm going to hand it back to you for closing comments.
Thank you, Sunny, and thank you to all of you for attending today, and for your thoughtful questions because we're all having them. And I encourage groups and organizations to take the first step in just trying, right? We're still fairly early in our sort of DEI mission in our journey, but we're taking those steps, and there will be mistakes, and we will recover from them. And that's what I've always wanted, right? As I mentioned in the beginning, being able to see things through to the end, to course correct, and to think about new strategies that we can implement. And so, just hope that I can be of service to any of you. If you have any follow-up questions, I'd be happy to take them and answer them, or do one-on-one conversations with you about this topic because I love it, and I love engaging with people on this issue. So, thank you so much.
Mm. Thank you. And I want to thank everybody who tuned in and joined this conversation and submitted such thoughtful questions. Please join us again next week for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I'll conclude the webinar. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody.